Now we're going to Philip. Mackowiak. Thank you. Dr. Philip Mackowiak is professor of medicine and the Carolyn Frenkil and Selvin Passen History of Medicine Scholar in Residence at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. He's a master of the American College of Physicians and a former governor of the Maryland chapter of the ACP. That's the American College of Physicians. For almost 2 decades, Dr. Mackowiak, did I get it? Yeah. Okay, great. Has hosted an internationally acclaimed series of historical clinicopathological conferences in Baltimore. These have given rise to over a score of peer-reviewed articles, as well as a book entitled Post Mortem, Solving History's Great Medical Mysteries. These works earned Dr. Mackowiak the American College of Physicians 2010 Nicholas E. Davies Memorial Scholar Award for scholarly activities in the humanities and history of medicine, and have established him as one of today's most accomplished medical historians. In 2013, Oxford University Press published a sequel to Post Mortem entitled Diagnosing Giants, Solving the Medical Mysteries of 13 Patients Who Changed the World. Let's give it up for Dr. Mackowiak.
Well, thank you all for staying. Last talk, last day. You're real troopers.
Oh, it's gonna be so good.
Better believe that. So, here's what we're talking about right here. I've gotten rich off of this book. As a matter of fact, I've made so much in royalties. Jeremy Wang, who's here from Oxford, I could take him out for a meal after this talk if one of us paid our own way. Now, one of the things I've noticed is that the most popular tent here is actually over there, Food for Thought. So rather than talk about diagnosing giants, I'm going to share my favorite recipe with you, if that's okay. So you take an eggplant. No, never mind. So let me give you a little background on this book, and then I'm going to read some excerpts from several chapters and tell you about these famous historical figures. But basically, this is a book that's based on this conference that I've hosted at the University of Maryland School of Medicine for the past 21 years. It's a conference that focuses on famous historical figures who have had mysterious illnesses that have yet to be diagnosed to the general satisfaction. Mysterious illnesses, in many cases, that were fatal, sometimes weren't. And I introduced these famous patients as unknowns early in the chapters, reveal them mid-chapter, and then discuss their illness in detail and try to come up with an appropriate diagnosis for these patients. In some cases, I simply add additional reinforcement to prior diagnoses that have been made. In several of the cases, I offer major new diagnoses. In the case of, say, Booker T. Washington, who was the subject of the first book, Post Mortem. We're talking about the second book. I actually tracked down his great-granddaughter, got access to his hospital record at the Rockefeller Hospital in New York, and was able to dispel a lingering myth that he died of syphilis, because there was a test for syphilis in the hospital record that was negative. So in any case, it's been a lot of fun, very interesting experience for me, a labor of love. Let me share parts of it with you. So, when I published the first book, I was asked to explain why people might be interested in it, and let me just share my thoughts along those lines with you. I suggested that this book and the case summaries that are presented in it, as well as the prequel to the book, offers a unique approach to history in which medical disorders of famous historical figures are dealt with as something more than footnotes to their lives. And if you're a fan of biographies, rarely is any time given to the illnesses of these famous people, even though, at least in some of the cases, they've had profound effects on their lives as well as their legacies. And I get into that big time in this book. For those who love history, they'll find an approach to the subject different from any they've encountered previously. I know of no other book that sort of deals with history through famous historical figures by way of the illnesses, mysterious illness they suffered with. For those fascinated with medical science, a new perspective on the evolution of some of the most important concepts of medical science. Because each chapter I discuss medicine as existed at the time of their lives and trace it throughout history, from King Tut all the way to Eleanor Roosevelt. For those who like biographies of famous people, a dozen unique biographical sketches of some of history's most important figures. Okay, let me start with chapter 13 in this book. I just gave you the introduction. The title is Too Busy to Be Sick. I think there's some important lessons here, which I'll share with you. This patient was no ordinary First Lady. She shattered the traditional mold of the position and refashioned it to fit her talents and to serve as an instrument of social reform. She was the first American chief executive's wife to hold and lose a government job, the first to testify before Congress, to address a national party convention, to hold regular press conferences, to write a syndicated daily column, to deliver sponsored radio broadcasts, to earn income on the lecture circuit, and to travel overseas to visit American troops at war. Her husband was President of the United States during as trying a time as any this nation has yet faced. He lost the use of his legs to polio 16 years after they were married, and had she not been so steadfast and raised her voice so vigorously against her mother-in-law in behalf of full recovery, he could easily have become an invalid. Fortunately for the country, she refused to treat him as an invalid and wouldn't allow others to do so. Though confined to a wheelchair for the remainder of his life, he persevered in politics and was elected president in 1932, a decade after becoming paralyzed, and then re-elected in 1936, in 1940, and again in 1944. To no small degree, she was the one who made it possible for him to carry on in spite of his disability. When a world war came to dominate her husband's presidency, the patient became his principal advisor on social issues. The eyes and ears that gathered the grassroots information he needed to understand the people he governed. Who was that? Well, of course, that was Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, who did not see the Roosevelts? Ken Burns, just on TV. Who did see it? There we go. Well, a comprehensive sort of to torture. He covered everything in excruciating detail. But when Ken Burns got to Eleanor Roosevelt's death, it was a footnote at best. And yet her death was both mysterious and very significant in terms of its lesson for Americans. It was mysterious because she had a failing bone marrow, which was diagnosed as aplastic anemia. I give it a slightly different diagnosis. But that was not the most interesting or important aspect of her death. It was her end-of-life care, where her team of physicians, who were New York physicians, we will not mention the institution, would not give up. She's begging to die. She's spitting out pills. She's hiding them under her tongue. And yet they kept pressing and pressing to the point that when she finally died, they performed cardiopulmonary resuscitation on her, including intracardiac epinephrine and mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. So, there are your lessons here. I go into some detail in discussing more of her end-of-life care in this particular chapter and her diagnosis. And we can talk about this some more if you'd like during the question and answer session. So, how about another one? Other interesting aspects to this case. This was chapter 7. Again, can I mention this book here? Yeah, thank you. So, the title is A Medical Labyrinth. See if you know who this famous patient was. North Americans know this patient's name, but very little else about him, and yet none of the heroes of South America ranks higher in accomplishments as a soldier and statesman, or was more admired in his day by Americans and Europeans for his struggle to institute liberty where tyranny had reigned. His exploits, more than those of anyone, were responsible for Spain's loss of its transatlantic colonies. According to Hiram Bigham of the Geographic Journal, which is a precursor of National Geographic, quote, his passage of the Andes was mightier than Hannibal's passage of the Alps. His marches were longer than those of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. His audacity in risking odds equaled Marlborough's, while his patience under reverse, his skill in heading dispirited, half-mutinous armies, and his never-failing ingenuity as a state strategist entitled him to the praises somewhat begrudgingly bestowed by Wellington of being an extraordinary commander. Bingham's hyperbole aside, this patient's feats of endurance and his accomplishments were nothing short of astonishing. He founded 3 republics and was the primary magistrate of 3 countries, 2 of which now bear his name. He was revered by the likes of Lafayette, Lord Byron, and George Washington's family, who sent him a bust of George Washington. For a time while he lived, he was idealized and mythologized until the brilliance of his persona exceeded that of even his extraordinary legacy. However, when he had run the race that fate allotted, he died in a modest countryside house, poor, persecuted, and accompanied by only a few friends and faithful servants. Who was it?
Bolivar?
Say again?
Bolivar?
That's exactly right. Simon Bolivar. Simon, as I say, Americans know his name, but almost nothing else. North Americans, almost nothing else about him. Well, interesting case for a number of reasons. For me personally, because he was discussed at our Clinicopathological conference at the University of Maryland School of Medicine by a Hopkins infectious disease expert by the name of Paul Allwater. Wonderful, lovely guy, and he diagnoses chronic arsenic intoxication. Arsenic that Bolivar was exposed to during his campaign through the Andes, which has high levels of arsenic. And we differ in our diagnosis, but that was the primary one that caught the attention of Hugo Chavez. Who was Hugo Chavez, and what would he have to do with this? So he was the president of Venezuela Republic, Bolivarian Republic, okay? Died recently of pancreatic cancer. But while he was alive, his major mission was to prove that the Colombians had assassinated his hero, Bolivar. So Chavez used to have an empty seat at his cabinet meetings, which was a seat for Bolivar. I mean, it was just wild stuff. like a seance type stuff. And so the conference was on Friday. Sunday morning, the Venezuelan ambassador to the United States shows up at my home in Annapolis to discuss Bolivar. I mean, it was wild stuff. And then a couple weeks later, they exhumed Bolivar, took a tooth and some bone from his remains for analysis. Not because of this conference necessarily, because Chavez was already committed to doing that, but this conference seems speeded up his activities along those lines. The results of those analyses are not yet available. I go into a discussion of those analyses, and as it turns out, almost no matter what you find, the interpretation is invariably possible because of contamination from the exterior, arsenic, from the dust that's flying around. You don't know whether it was pre-mortem or post-mortem. But in any case, some other issues that I get into. All right, here's another one you might find interesting. This is chapter 9. The title is Mortal Wound. This patient was a mongrel, a mixture of all sorts, as only America brings forth. He was a common man who was yet uncommon, both steel and velvet, hard as a rock and soft as a drifting fog, who held in his heart and mind the paradox of terrible storm and peace unspeakable and perfect. He had a face so awful ugly that some related it to the ugliest eyes ever beheld. Others saw beauty in it emanating from bright, dreamy eyes that seemed to gaze through you without looking at you. While he lived, he was vilified as an, quote, ape, gorilla, fool, filthy storyteller, despot, liar, thief, braggart, baboon, usurper, monster, tortoise, ignoramus, old scoundrel, perjurer, robber, swindler, tyrant, fiend, butcher, land pirate. But after he was dead, words could not be found to adequately describe the magnificence of the man or his legacy. He was never in a college or an academy as a student and didn't study English grammar until he was 23 and a lawyer. Even so, when called upon to honor his nation's fallen soldiers, he was as eloquent as Pericles. He had a mind like a piece of steel, very hard to scratch anything on it, and almost impossible after it was there to rub it out. Though lacking in administrative experience and dismissed as a third-rate Western lawyer and fourth-rate lecturer, ignorant of proper grammar, he had no superior as a stump speaker. When elected president, he was more of an executive than almost anyone expected. He told hilarious, self-deprecating stories that made him laugh harder than anyone else. But when circumstances called on him to save the nation from extinction, he was as cool as death. So who was he? Of course it was Lincoln, and most of that verbiage is not mine. That's straight from Sandberg. Isn't that beautiful stuff? So what was Lincoln's mystery? He got a bullet right through the left side of his head, thanks to John Wilkes Booth, that basically blew out the left half of his brain. So during our bicentennial celebration at the medical school, University of Maryland, the head of our shock trauma center, Tom Scalia, discussed the case. And the question posed to him was, if Lincoln had been shot today rather than in 1865, what could you all have done for him? So he's going through, he's telling me he's doing all this stuff and that and cutting here, you know, and when it's all over, he concludes that he would have saved him. Blew out most of the left brain. And I'm thinking, this is ridiculous. And then, of course, Gabby Gifford came along. You know, Gabby Gifford shot the congresswoman, same side, same trajectory of the bullet, different caliber, different speed, etc. So they weren't alike. She was saved. So it is possible that they could have. So I go into well, actually, what I do in that chapter is paraphrase Tom Scalia's entire discussion of how he would have treated a woman, and then I follow up with Gabby Gifford and her circumstances. Okay, last one. This is chapter 10. Title is Voyage to Invalidism. Invalidism, as in an invalid. Voyage to Invalidism. It's doubt that any work save Newton's Principia ever caused so profound and rapid a revolution in science or made so deep an impression on our thinking as this patient's book. It caused us to reevaluate our place among living creatures by laying bare how closely interconnected and endlessly changing is the web of life. Nothing in medicine makes sense today except in light of his theory. Even personalized medicine, with all its modern trappings and its use of sophisticated genetic analyses to individualize healthcare, owes its existence to insights he provided over a century and a half ago. Before this patient developed and published his theory, the myriad species of living organisms that populate our planet were thought to be immutable and fixed. Individual life forms, whether sea anemone, muskox, or bark beetle, existed as imperfect approximations of a creator's ideal. Individual variations were viewed as irrelevant blemishes, unworthy of study. This patient recognized the crucial importance of such variations in determining how we came to be who we are and why we will not be the same beings indefinitely. Think about that. Because of him, we have come to realize that humans do not stand apart from the rest of biology as biblical scripture teaches, but are literally, not metaphorically, related to the birds of the air and lilies of the field. So revolutionary were these ideas that many considered them, and some still do, not just implausible, but immoral and irreligious. His ideas shook social convention at its core, which is why for a time some considered him, quote, the most dangerous man in England. Darwin. Now this you're not going to believe. So Darwin comes back from his voyage aboard the Beagle. 3-4 years, I forget what it was, 5 years. Long voyage, and he's still a young man, and he's in good shape. But a year after he returns, and there was some evidence of this as a teenager, he starts vomiting after every meal. For 30 years, he's vomiting after every meal. I mean, it's a strange kind of vomitness because he never vomits up food. He doesn't lose weight. He's able to work. Produces some of the most important scientific work ever performed. And then mysteriously, 30 years later, it's 50 years old. So for this particular conference, we had an expert, I mean one of the world experts on diseases of the upper gastrointestinal tract, come and discuss his case. and his diagnosis is cyclic vomiting syndrome. I'm sitting here in the audience and I'm thinking, I've never heard of cyclic vomiting syndrome, but how bad is this? The patient comes in and says, for 30 years, I've been having these cycles of vomiting every day. So, oh, well, you have cyclic vomiting syndrome. Well, I mean, what's the but by the way, sort of the going diagnosis, the most popular one, although many have been suggested for Darwin, was that he was a hypochondriac. But in fact, he fits the profile for cyclic vomiting syndrome, which is a real syndrome, but one of it. And the question is, what is the good of a name when it doesn't tell you what the cause is, what the mechanisms are, how to make the patient better, how to cure them, which is basically the case with cyclic vomiting syndrome. And medicine is guilty, more often than not, of that kind of chicanery, chronic fatigue syndrome. Give it a name, and you've done something. Irritable bowel syndrome. Give it a name, you've done something. Earned your, your fee. So that's the last one I want to review with you. Let me just mention that some of the other patients that are reviewed in the book, and you can ask any questions you want about these. There's the Buddha, and it's the Buddha, not Buddha. The Buddha, Caligula, Saladin, John Paul Jones, Goya, Stonewall Jackson, Lenin, and Mary Alonzo. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for staying.